tortured logic. According to the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, the German citizen Khalid al-Masri was abducted by CIA officials at the Serbian-Macedonian border on 31 December 2003. The officials had mistakenly identified al-Masri as a member of Al-Qaeda and a possible participant in a New Ulm-based terrorist cell. Khalid al-Masri spent nearly 5 months in a secret CIA detention center in Afghanistan. During this time, he was regularly interrogated, subjected to physical abuse, and humiliated. Eventually, the CIA brought him to Albania, where he was released. He arrived back in Germany on 29 May 2004. Despite years of inquiry and protest at his mistreatment, al-Masri has never received any form of reparation or even apology from the United States for his mistreatment. Contrast that with Abu Zubaydah. Abu Zubaydah has been in the United States custody since his capture in Pakistan in March of 2002. He was thought at the time to be a major figure in Al-Qaeda, and his capture set off a debate at the highest levels of the Bush administration as to what measures could be taken to interrogate him. Two psychologists, James E. Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, had developed a program called SERE, S-E-R-E, which was supposed to train U.S. military officials to withstand torture if they were captured. The CIA ultimately seized on this program, and having gotten the approval they needed, transported Abu Zubaydah to Thailand in 2002. According to the New York Times summary of the recent Senate Intelligence Report, within days of the Justice Department's approval to begin waterboarding the prisoner, Abu Zubaydah's sessions became so extreme that some CIA officers were to the point of tears and choking up, and several said they would elect to be transferred out of the facility if the brutal interrogation continued. During one waterboarding session, Abu Zubaydah became completely unresponsive with bubbles rising through his open, full mouth. The interrogations lasted for weeks, and some CIA officers began sending messages to the agency's headquarters in Virginia, questioning the utility and the legality of what they were doing. But such questions were rejected, end quote. Abu Zubaydah is still in U.S. custody in Guantanamo today. It was long ago determined that he was never a member of Al-Qaeda. We've known something about these cases for years, but they and others have come into sharp focus recently with the release of the report of the Senate Committee on Intelligence, December 9, 2014. Torture. The word comes from roots meaning twisting, turning. And what I hope to show this morning is how this program of torture came about by twisting words out of their normal meanings under the pressure of political power. This will involve talking about lawyers. I don't want this to be a law lecture, though. It's about how legal principles can be bent to serve the interests of those who call the tune. Torture is and has been for decades a clear violation of international law as well as U.S. law. How then did the CIA, in the early years of the so-called War on Terror, come to resort to interrogation techniques which amounted to torture? What does the recent Senate report tell us? The New York Times summary says there are 7 key features which have come out of this report that are different from what we knew before. First, the CIA's interrogation techniques were more brutal and employed more extensively than the agency portrayed. Secondly, the CIA interrogation program was mismanaged and was not subject to adequate oversights. The architects of the program, psychologists Mitchell and Jessen, had never carried out a real interrogation. The report states that the CIA resisted congressional oversight, restricted access to information, declined to answer questions about the program, and impeded oversights by the agency's Inspector General by providing false information. Third, the CIA misled members of Congress and the White House about the effectiveness and extent of its brutal interrogation techniques. Fourth, interrogators in the field who tried to stop the brutal techniques were repeatedly overruled by senior CIA officials. Fifth, the CIA repeatedly underreported the number of people it detained and subjected to harsh interrogation techniques under this program. Sixth, at least 26 detainees were wrongfully held and did not meet the government's standard for detention. This included one intellectually challenged man held in an attempt to get information out of a relative. Seventh, the CIA leaked classified information to journalists, exaggerating the success of the interrogation methods in an effort to gain public support. Now, since the release of the Senate committee report, there's been a lively counterattack by former Vice President Cheney, who claims not only that the techniques were legal, but that they got good intelligence. This claim of effectiveness is a red herring. If the techniques had been legal, their effectiveness would be interesting in a political and historical context if we're assessing the overall competence of the Bush administration's so-called war on terror. But we are beyond that. A foreign human rights group has lodged a criminal complaint against the American architects of this policy. That complaint asserts that the techniques were illegal, that they amounted to torture. If this is correct, it doesn't matter legally how effective the techniques might have been in getting information. The Convention Against Torture is quite explicit. In fact, I printed it in your order of service today, the second article of the Convention of Torture. No exceptional circumstances whatsoever, whether a state of war or a threat of war, internal political instability, or any other public emergency may be invoked as a justification of torture. If what the CIA did was torture, Cheney's defense of effectiveness amounts to saying that the end justifies the means. And this is and has always been bad ethics. If this criminal complaint is allowed to proceed to the substance of the accusations, then the result will depend on whether what the CIA did amounted to torture. And that will involve the validity of a series of remarkable legal opinions by a lawyer named John Yoo. That's Y-O-O. Let me digress here for a moment. A government lawyer occupies a unique position of public trust. He or she must advise government whether any action it plans to take is legal or not. Chatham's most famous summer resident, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, was also one of the most piercing intellects when it came to the role of government. He said, "Government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or ill, it teaches the whole people by its example." Lawyers are trained to find loopholes, to find ways for their clients to do what the client wants to do. But lawyers are also the last bastion of law enforcement. When the law clearly speaks on a question, it is up to the lawyer to tell the client what the law is, even when all the powers of government are ranged against it. John Yoo failed in this most crucial duty. John Yoo was born in South Korea, but came to this country as a child, was a brilliant student at Harvard Law School, and went on to prestigious judicial clerkships, including clerking for Justice Clarence Thomas of the U.S. Supreme Court. Afterwards, he landed a position teaching at Stanford Law School, which he still holds. His specialty is the limits of presidential power, and he doesn't see many of them. In the George W. Bush administration, Yoo was hired into the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, working under Attorney General John Ashcroft. The Office of Legal Counsel is supposed to function as the conscience of the executive branch, fielding questions from all over the executive branch of what you can and cannot do. In March of 2002, as I said just now, the CIA captured Abu Zubaydah, whom it considered a valuable information source, and requested an opinion on what its limits were in interrogating this prisoner. This resulted in a debate at the highest levels of the administration, and it resulted in what is known as the torture memo, drafted by John Yoo and signed off on by J. Bybee, who was head of the Office of Legal Counsel, on August 1st, 2002. The Senate report notes that the memo was based on bad information supplied by the CIA, who had told the Justice Department that the prisoner was the third or fourth highest al-Qaeda operative, who had valuable information about a planned further attack on the U.S., but who had become uncooperative. The Senate report noted that this information conveyed to the executive branch was actually contradicted in the July CIA email, which said CIA officers did not believe Zubaydah was withholding information. And later the CIA determined Zubaydah was never a member of al-Qaeda. But you had found that waterboarding and sleep deprivation did not constitute torture by redefining torture as only that infliction of pain which results in serious physical injury, such as organ failure, impairment of bodily function, or even death. Bybee went on to be named a federal judge in March of 2003, just before the invasion of Iraq. You then took over as temporary head of the Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department. A few days after he assumed this position, he issued an opinion to the Department of Defense that enhanced interrogation of terror suspects overseas would not violate the U.S. statute against torture. That memo was later determined to have been the legal justification that the military relied on for its excesses at Abu Ghraib and at Guantanamo. Yu's memo had won in favor with the administration, and the White House wanted him to be the permanent head of the Office of Legal Counsel. But Attorney General Ashcroft, who seems to have been queasy about the enhanced interrogation program, vetoed this and chose a lawyer named Jack Goldsmith. After Goldsmith assumed the office, the Abu Ghraib scandal broke, and Goldsmith determined that the torture memos needed to be withdrawn. In a later memoir, he characterized them as cursory and one-sided legal arguments. You went back to teaching at Stanford. The whole interrogation program was halted on the second day of the Obama administration. Thus, the office, which is supposed to be the conscience of the executive branch of government, became swept up into policy imperatives and gave tortured interpretations of the relevant statutes. Now, does this have anything to do with religion, you may well ask? Well, our second principle commits us to affirm and promote justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. These are fine general values, but the devil is in the details. When you get lawyers involved, justice sometimes gets obscured. There's the famous story of the lawyer who had a case under advisement in a court and telegraphed his client, justice has triumphed, and the client telegraphed back, appeal at once. I believe the law, in which I served for 30 years of my life, to be an honorable profession, though it has its share of scoundrels. But the public does not appreciate that as much as lawyers are expected to chop logic and find loopholes for their clients, there are clear ethical limits to the advice they can render. A lawyer cannot advise a client, whether an individual, a corporation, or government, to take a course of action the lawyer knows to be clearly forbidden by the law. This is a special case of speaking truth to power. A government lawyer is always called on to speak truth to power, to advise political officials when a proposed course of action is clearly illegal. To my mind, the religious value at stake here is not justice, equity, or compassion. It is integrity. Integrity is the ability to call it as one sees it, to speak from the plain language of the relevant legal provisions and their plain purpose, regardless of political popularity or military necessity. Clearly, those who drafted the Convention Against Torture intended that the definition of torture embraced any substantial amount of suffering deliberately inflicted on a prisoner, and did not brook any justification for torture on account of any circumstances whatsoever. When I think of integrity, I think of Elliot Richardson, who resigned as Attorney General rather than follow Richard Nixon's order to fire the first Watergate Special Prosecutor, Archibald Cox. He could not serve as president and the law simultaneously, and so he resigned rather than go down in history as an Attorney General tainted with the criminal acts of a rogue president. I also think it is no accident that Richardson was a Unitarian Universalist. The high value that Unitarians place on integrity goes back to the old idea of salvation by character, which originally meant imitating Jesus in the conduct of one's life, but came to have a strong component also of being true to oneself. This above all else, says Polonius to Laertes, to thine own self be true, and it will follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. I'm not suggesting that Unitarians have a monopoly on integrity, or that all UUs live up to the ideal of integrity. For me, it is an aspiration. But the aspiration is tested for anyone whenever we have a choice between standing up for the truth and doing the convenient or profitable thing. John Yoo was a lawyer on whom the neocons plotting the war on terror relied for legal advice as to how far their interrogations could go. He did not tell them what the law was. He told them what they wanted to hear. If I were drawing up a complaint for the European Human Rights Group, John Yoo would certainly be one of the individuals named. Reverend Bill Schultz is a great UU minister who has served as president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, president of Amnesty International, and is currently president of the UU Service Committee. In his involvement with Amnesty, he came into close contact with victims of torture, and he wrote an article sometime about 5-10 years ago in which he asserted that evil is real. Well, you know that I'm writing a book on evil, and I seized on this, and I confronted it in the halls of the General Assembly last June, asking whether he could square this assertion that evil is real with the universalist notion that all evil is an illusion. He thought about it for a minute and said what he meant was that people who commit human rights violations like torture need to be accountable for their actions. Well, I have to agree with this. In my thinking about evil, I am moving far away from the idea of retribution. Retribution is the deliberate infliction of pain or suffering in retaliation for a wrong the offender has committed. Our criminal justice system is too heavily dependent on retribution. On the other hand, the commands of the law have no value if there's not accountability. If government officials can get by with instituting programs of torture when they deem it necessary to get information or to repel an attack, the protections of the Convention on Torture are worthless. The problem, of course, is that much of the American public still buys the notion that these techniques were necessary to protect us from further terrorist attack. When government engages in a criminal prosecution, it will not succeed unless there's already moral consensus to support it. This is why the Obama administration has been reluctant to proceed aggressively with those who condone torture in the prior administration. They probably could not get convictions out of a jury of average Americans. But we must start somewhere. Unless there is accountability for those who have broken the laws against torture, these protections written into the law, the international law and the U.S. law, will be empty promises. If the most powerful nation on earth can simply ignore international too. What Justice Brandeis said with respect to the criminal law could just as easily have been said with respect to the international laws against torture. Our government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or for ill, it teaches the whole people by its example. Crime is contagious. If the government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for law. It invites every man to become a law unto himself. It invites anarchy. To declare that in the administration of the criminal law, the end justifies the means. To declare that the government may commit crimes in order to secure the conviction of a private criminal would bring terrible retribution. Against that pernicious doctrine, this court should resolutely set its face